Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. We're so glad to have you join us today. My name is Amber Robinson, and I am pleased to be the moderator for today's webinar. Just a little bit about me before I introduce our esteemed guests. My name is, again, Amber Robinson. I'm an environmental scientist for HDR Engineering here in Lafayette, Louisiana. I also serve as the co-chair for the webinar committee and have been a member of SWS for many years, including having my professional wetland scientist credential. So as always, we are so excited to share this SWS e-learning experience for you all to stay engaged virtually and continue to earn your continued education credits. I do want to remind you, if you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat box that you can see down below. And then for any questions, which I encourage you to have, use the Q&A box below. Today's lecture and topic will be development and implementation of an agricultural wetlands mitigation bank. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speakers today, Will Duggins and Tyler Bell. Will Duggins and Tyler Bell work in Westervelt Ecological Services Rocky Mountain region, with Will as the business development manager and Tyler as the regional director. Will Duggins has 10 years of project management, business development, due diligence, siting, permitting, and GIS mapping experience. Will has led project teams on a range of acquisition and development projects throughout the Rockies and the West Coast. Tyler has 18 years of experience in wetland research, permitting, and mitigation experience. She is also a professional wetland scientist and serves as secretary for the Rocky Mountain chapter of the Society of Wetland Scientists. She's also a certified wildlife biologist. So without further ado, here's Will and Tyler.
Hey, thanks for the intro, Amber. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I told them I knew how to do this. Why is this? Yeah. One sec. There we go. All right. Sorry for that glitch. Okay. So again, Amber, thank you for that intro. Tyler and I have kind of split this talk into two different parts. So I'm going to be taking the first half of the presentation, and really I'm going to be covering kind of our company's background and some regulatory background that ultimately guided Westervelt's decision to go ahead and develop and implement this kind of novel project in Nebraska. It's a really cool project, so we're really excited to share it with everyone. So as a brief intro, as Amber said, my name is Will Duggins. I am the business development manager for Westervelt out here in the Rockies region. We're located in Golden, Colorado, and have a team out here of professional wetland scientists, wildlife biologists to kind of support as our technical team. And they really support all of our projects that we execute on the ground. As an ecological services company, Westervelt fills a very specific niche. We do mitigation, and we do mitigation in the form of species mitigation, wetland mitigation, and stream mitigation. In my previous career, I was a petroleum geologist in upstream oil and gas. I didn't really deal a lot with mitigation other than species mitigation from time to time. So it's been a really great kind of career change and learning experience to come to Westervelt, start looking at putting these awesome projects on the ground that really seek to restore large habitats and ecosystems. Westervelt Ecological Services was started by the Westervelt Company back in 2006. The Westervelt Company has been around for a very long time. It's a family-owned company and has had 139 years of continuous family management. We're now in the 5th generation of management with Cade Warner, who's going to be kind of taking over the leadership of the company in the near future. We've really, over the past, since 2006, I should say, Westervelt has pursued a variety of different project types, but our bread and butter and what our real focus is mitigation and conservation banks. And the project we'll be talking about today falls under the category of a mitigation bank. It's just not necessarily a 404 mitigation bank, which is what people are probably more familiar with on this call. We also do a variety of other services, such as permitting responsible mitigation and mitigation feasibility analysis, various service contracts related to mitigation. These service contracts can really be anything. It can be someone looking to do potential restoration on their land that's not even necessarily associated with mitigation. One contract we have, for example, with Boulder, they are looking to do some mitigation that's not necessarily 404 mitigation, but it's at a city level. And then we're also doing voluntary restoration that kind of a lot of times utilizes grant funding and municipal funding to develop and implement ESG driven projects. So since we own a lot of our own projects, since Westervelt owns a lot of our own projects, and we manage large tracts of land, we can really leverage our expertise and land management skills to kind of inform people on, what will work long-term, how to create durable restoration projects that over time really become more robust and don't end up costing them down the road with various failures. So we really focus on kind of long-term stewardship and designing projects in that vein. So to date, we have some really impressive numbers, and I'm not going to read each of these, but suffice it to say, we've done more than 30,000 acres of restoration and protection. And I think when it comes down to it, at the heart of our company, this is what we really want to focus on. We want to focus on not only enhancing or restoring landscapes, but also protecting those landscapes. And typically those landscapes are protected via conservation easement. So those conservation easements act to protect these lands in perpetuity. And Westervelt takes on typically a lot of the long-term management of these landscapes. So that kind of gets back to the point I made a little bit ago about making sure that we design these projects so that they really stand the test of time and stand up to changes that Mother Nature may bring. We are really focused on species, in particular in California. On the right side of the screen, those numbers are largely driven by our California assets. The species and state protections out there are just so significant compared to the rest of the US. So, that has been really a huge focus in our California region. In addition, we have branched out to put some species mitigation on the ground in Mississippi. So we have a gopher tortoise mitigation bank in Mississippi. And then the project we'll be talking today is a company first. So this is an ag mitigation bank. And it was our first step out into the state of Nebraska. So this map shows our Rockies region footprint. We were established obviously in Denver, in the Denver area. Our region was established back in 2018. In addition to our region, we also have a pretty large group out in Sacramento. They function mainly in California at this time, but ultimately they do kind of have the whole West Coast. And then we have a large group as well down in Auburn, Alabama. Our Auburn team mainly manages and does restoration projects on Westervelt Company owned land throughout the Southeast. The Westervelt Company itself is a large timber and lumber company, so they have a lot of private land throughout the Southeast. The Rockies region is a little bit more Wild West. We've kind of had to carve out our own niche out here, and mitigation is relatively new to our region. So we started with the Big Thompson Confluence Mitigation Bank, which was a very ambitious 404 mitigation project focused on wetland and stream restoration. It's located up near Greeley, and so just north of Denver, about an hour and a half or so. And then we also have another 404 wetland mitigation bank out in Fort Morgan, Colorado, which is kind of northeast Colorado. So in addition to those two dots that are shown on the map, we've obviously branched out into Nebraska with this North Utica Ag Mitigation Bank, which is kind of in the south, eastern central portion of the state. And we've done some permittee responsible turnkey mitigation in the northern part of the state. It's a really exciting project for us that's really, helping to grow our footprint in the state of Nebraska. And we're really excited about that. We're kind of working our way through due diligence on that land and hoping to close that contract in the coming months. And then we're also doing some service contracts focused on the entire Colorado River Basin. We have a very cool contract with National Forest Foundation, looking at low-tech process-based restoration throughout the Colorado River Basin. And that's kind of occupying, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. So that's a work in progress, and it will be a publicly available kind of public-facing website. So once we're kind of done with that, we're happy to kind of share that with the group and let you all take a look at it, because I think it's going to have some really exciting potential restoration projects for ecological folks to pursue. Okay, so kind of getting into really, I think the nuts and bolts of why everyone's kind of joining today. This NRCS Agricultural Wetland Mitigation Banking Program. So that's going to be really kind of the focus from here on out. I'll have a few more slides and then kind of turn it over to Tyler, who's our regional director out here in the Rockies. But before we get started, I think this is as good of a time as any to ask for a poll. So I would love to do a poll on who all has heard of agricultural wetland banking. There should be a pop-up on your screen, so go ahead and answer whenever you see it. Pretty good split, actually. I'm surprised. I thought there would be way more no's, but that's good. That's good to know. So about 55-45. So this agricultural wetland mitigation banking program, I think it has been around for a while through the NRCS. But this in particular is the first one that has been implemented in the state of Nebraska. So it's a pilot project, and we worked really closely with the NRCS and specifically Rich Nelson, who's a fantastic guy. If you're ever in Lincoln, Nebraska and need some time to kill, I can get you Rich's contact info. He's down to grab a beer or something. He's a really cool dude. He is the state wetland biologist, or was the state wetland biologist, I should say, and is now the state wildlife biologist and forester with the NRCS in Nebraska. So we worked really closely with Rich to develop this, this first banking program in the state. Westervelt, I think, brought to the NRCS a lot of experience, obviously, with Corps of Engineers projects, which this was kind of largely modeled off of. So that reduced the learning curve. I won't say that the learning curve, though, was short. Implementing anything new is always kind of an experience, and this was no different. But we were able to help develop some of the templates, perform stakeholder engagement and regulatory engagement, and kind of implementing those strategies. And then just moving through the approval process wasn't super foreign to us. We kind of knew what to expect, especially since it was kind of modeled on the 404 program. Ultimately, the goal of this program was, to help farmers and help maintain USDA compliance and the associated benefits with USDA subsidies. So farmers are obviously reliant on various subsidy programs, and those all flow through the USDA. The NRCS is part of the USDA. So this is ultimately aimed at helping farmers address any wetland issues that they may have. So compensatory mitigation, just for a little bit of background, I think most of the people on here probably know this, but ultimately, when it comes to wetland mitigation banking specifically, we're seeking to restore, create, or enhance wetlands to compensate for unavoidable impacts to those wetlands at another location. I would think, especially us, we deal mostly with 404 wetlands. That's, kind of the bread and butter of their company nationwide and has been for a long time. But in this case, it's used to offset impacts for agriculture. So there are times when a farmer may need to fill a wetland in their field or impact a wetland for whatever reason. And in that case, this kind of gives them an option to mitigate for those potential impacts. From a regulatory standpoint, this is a really great slide that Tyler actually put together. And I think it's just a very good comparison of kind of where the regulations exist on both and how they kind of complement or, contrast with one another. So the regulatory text that kind of provides this underlying need for mitigation on 404 impacts is really the Clean Water Act. From the NRCS ag mitigation side of things, it is the Farm Bill, so the 1985 Food Security Act, and specifically kind of the Swampbusters provisions within that. From a regulatory lead agency standpoint, 404 is obviously U.S. Army Corps. In this case, it's NRCS for the ag mitigation. And as far as the wetlands go, 404 mitigation is really concerned with jurisdictional wetlands, whatever that means now, because WOTUS is always up in the air, it seems like. But those impacts for NRCS ag mitigation can be either Army Corps jurisdictional or non-jurisdictional. A lot of the impacts that have been brought to our attention fall under non-jurisdictional. They're localized small wetlands that don't really have any connectivity to waters of the U.S. 404 mitigation was really standardized with the 2008 mitigation rule. NRCS, a little bit more wild. There's not a hugely standardized approach. And so that, obviously makes some complications when it comes down to enforcement and things of that nature. 404 mitigation is a nationwide run agency, basically. And then NRCS ag mitigation is state by state. And really it functions even smaller than that. It's almost like county by county. The NRCS, while it is a federal agency, is largely also a local agency. There are folks sitting in county offices, right? And that's if you're a farmer in a county and you have an issue and you need to go see your NRCS person, you drive to the county location, and they probably live within or very close to the county. So it feels much more local on that level. And then with 404 mitigation, with a mitigation bank, there's always an interagency review team. So bringing in people from Fish and Wildlife Service, departments of water resources, things of that nature, state wildlife agencies. And in the NRCS world, it's a little bit more driven by who they want to have at the table. There's not necessarily a hugely standardized approach there. So diving a little bit more into the regulatory framework, I mentioned that the Farm Bill was really the impetus for why we can have agricultural mitigation. So the 1985 Farm Bill and the Swampbusters provisions within it really provided conservation compliance provisions for wetlands. And this was aimed to remove certain incentives that agricultural producers had in the past, where they were converting wetlands, filling wetlands, draining wetlands in order to increase their crop yields. So along with this provision, the USDA basically said to folks, okay, if you're going to take subsidies from the USDA, we're going to abide by the Swampbuster provision, and you need to sign this AD 1026 form. And this AD 1026 form basically affirmed that they were not going to drain, dredge, or fill wetlands in order to grow commodity crops. So that effectively started to limit agricultural producers' impacts on wetlands, because there was this kind of recognition of the importance of wetlands at that time. As I mentioned earlier, jurisdictional or non-jurisdictional, sometimes these wetlands can be jurisdictional. A lot of times they're not jurisdictional. And really the only jurisdiction they have would be from the NRCS's point of view. And ultimately, they're basically looking at these wetlands and stating, like, you have a wetland here, if you've done anything to manipulate or hurt that wetland, then we get into kind of the conversation around mitigation. And I think one other thing just to kind of point out here, these wetlands they're largely defined by the presence of hydrology, not necessarily hydrophytes, because a lot of times the vegetation here has been completely converted and it's being farmed, right? You might be in a wetland, but a farmer, they can still farm the thing for corn or soybeans or whatever you may have it. So there's not necessarily going to be wetland vegetation there that keys out. So when we first started in on this program, I think it became pretty clear that there were going to be really kind of two pots of people here. There were going to be voluntary folks who, wanted to basically preemptively mitigate before they made impacts to their field. And then there were going to be enforcement-driven impacts. And those enforcement-driven impacts were largely going to be folks who had filled a wetland and basically got caught probably, were either turned in by their neighbor or maybe the NRCS did like a Google Earth search and saw that a wetland had been converted or manipulated. And now their subsidies are being withheld. They have kind of the NRCS, I should say, has kind of a zero tolerance policy when it comes to being out of compliance on your wetlands. So whether you farm 10 acres and impact, a half an acre of wetlands, or you farm 100,000 acres and impact a half an acre of wetlands on your farm, you're either in compliance or you're out of compliance. So for the folks who have really large operations, if they're out of compliance, they have a lot of money that is basically sitting on the sidelines in the form of subsidies that they're not able to necessarily take advantage of on a yearly basis. It gets withheld. So a voluntary purchase, though, conversely, is who Westervelt kind of markets to, right? We want to talk to people who may have wet spots in their field or may have crop rot in their field, and they ultimately want to increase their crop yields. So they see this as a really good way to effectively, be able to fill a kind of probably a poor wetland in the whole scheme of things, right? They're farming the thing year over year and seeding it. They just want to get more crop out of it. So they can easily come to Westervelt, they can contact Westervelt, and we can tell them, hey, we have a credit that will satisfy your need or not. The NRCS is involved most of the steps of the way. Typically, there's a producer who will reach out to us first, and then Westervelt will contact the NRCS to show them the wetland, make sure that the wetland is like and kind. And then NRCS will check to see if they have a certified wetland determination form on that parcel or on that wetland. If the certified wetland determination form was done after 2001, it's basically written in stone. So whatever is on that form is what it is, and the NRCS won't change it. So if they say this is 3 acres of wetland after 2001, they're not going to change it. If it's before 2001, the NRCS will come out. They will have to do a wetland assessment, do a certified wetland determination, and whatever comes out of it may be different than what's on the form, but they will stand by, obviously, the new one. And at the end of the day, it's a tool. Mitigation is a tool for any agency. Our mitigation banks in 404 land are U.S. Army Corps tools to help people mitigate. And in this case, this is really no different. The NRCS determines eligibility for folks and states whether or not they can mitigate utilizing our credits. Typically, if it is, the same type of wetland, which Tyler will get into a bit more detail in a few minutes, they will let them mitigate at a 1 credit equals 1 acre ratio. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler. I'm going to slide out of the way.
Slide on over. Awesome. Okay, hey everybody. Yeah, I'm going to dig more into the site now that Will's talked about the regulatory framework and what the relationships that led up to this and the regulatory text that led us to this. So our site is the North Utica Agricultural Mitigation Bank. It's located in Seward County, Nebraska. And it was a pretty exhaustive and lengthy search. We found and purchased a property in the Rainwater Basin in 2020 is when we closed on it. And this was a grant partnership with the NRCS And so it really was for anywhere in the state that had a need, but we identified some areas and kind of drilled in and started looking for land in those areas, in those higher need areas. So this site is located within the Central Flyway. It's an important route for migratory birds. There are over 8 million waterfowl that utilize this route during spring migration alone. It's about historically a 11,000 kilometer squared area. It's 4,200 square miles, and it's distinctly characterized by shallow playa wetlands that are scattered within flat to gently rolling loess plains, and it's located south of the Platte River in south central Nebraska. So before European American settlement, the region contained approximately 11,000 acres of wetlands, and 11,000 wetlands, ranging in size from less than an acre to over 1,000 acres each. The wetlands are fed by runoff from snowmelt, springtime rains, and intense summer storms. And they're usually dried up by late summer. And so, like I mentioned, this property is in Seward County. Buying agricultural lands in a fertile and productive area was difficult, and farmers don't really like seeing productive agricultural land taken out of production, despite the historic presence of wetlands. We like this property because it is adjacent to North Lake Basin Wildlife Management Area, which is another playa wetland, or it's the same playa wetland that was partially restored. So this added to that wetland, that contiguous wetland footprint. And yeah, so I mean, really conserving and reestablishing high quality wetlands in the region that have been decimated, and providing a tool for ag producers to streamline their operations, increase crop yields, and utilize their remaining or to do that, to remain in compliance and receive subsidies, ends up kind of being difficult ground that we have to straddle. But if you look at this map, the area in blue is the bank service area. So this was determined by NRCS in hopes of providing offsets to regional depressional precipitation driven playa wetlands. And this is the area that the NRCS identified not only had a need, but would likely have these wetlands, and kind of provide that in-kind offset that we often talk about in 404 compensatory mitigation, but kind of aligning with that idea. So there were multiple stakeholders on this site. Like I said, we received an NRCS mitigation banking grant to help develop and to help fund and develop the implementation of the project. This grant money cannot be used for land purchases, so it can be used for implementation, but not land purchases. And it's paid out on a milestone basis. So as project successes and performance standards are realized, we get paid the grant monies. The stakeholders are obviously NRCS, but NRCS is really collaborative. And so while there's not a defined interagency review team approach, like Will talked about early on, they did consult folks that are obvious stakeholders. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Nebraska Game and Parks, the Water District, the Seward County, the Village of Utica, where it's located, and the Corps of Engineers. And because we own these properties, and they own this property, and these projects exist in perpetuity, Westervelt also gives a lot of consideration to our neighbors. Having good relationship with the neighbors is really important, and we recognize that. And also, these neighbors are typically and often the end user, so they can be clients. The agricultural producers in the area are an incredibly important stakeholder on the client end of this. So like Will said, the clients may be voluntarily purchasing credits because they heard that our project exists, or because the regional NRCS program has educated them on that, or they might be out of compliance and need to purchase credits to receive their crop insurance subsidies and participate in other farm bill projects or programs. And the NRCS has directed them our way for that purpose. First, we started with the delineation, and I have another poll question about agricultural delineations. And so just a quick question, who's heard of delineating using the regulatory guidance letter 90-07, the clarification of the phrase normal circumstances as it pertains to cropped wetlands? All right, cool. Okay, so we've got about 30% that are aware of this Regal 90s-7 and 70% that are not. And I'm going to briefly go over what that is, but it was a big driver in the way we delineated these wetlands. So first, with any delineation, we started with desktop due diligence, comprising utilizing the NRCS Web Soil Survey, historic aerial imagery, the Fish and Wildlife Service information for planning and consultation tool, the IPAC tool, the FSA compliance historical aerial photography that represents normal, dry, and wet precipitation years. That's called WETS precipitation data. And then, we understood as much as we could about the site before getting on the ground. And we do that in our due diligence period prior to purchase. And then when we were able to get on the ground and when the seasonally it was appropriate, we conducted an abbreviated wetland delineation following methods as described in the 1987 Corps of Engineers Wetland Delineation Manual, and we used the regional supplement for the Great Plains region. And then we recorded data on vegetation, soils, and hydrology on the routine determination forms. So we also had to utilize the regional, the regional supplement. I think chapter 5 has some guidance on farmed wetlands, but we had to heavily rely on the regulatory guidance letter 90-07, which, as I said, was the clarification of the phrase normal circumstances as it pertains to cropped wetlands, because wetlands in a farm circumstance often appear differently than what we're used to. We're, as when I say we, I say wetland scientists. So a wetland scientist, we're typically delineating for core jurisdictional wetlands, and we look for those 3 coward and indicators. So we're looking for hydrophytes, hydric soil, and wetland hydrology. When you're looking at a cultivated ag field, you're likely not going to have the vegetation present. So you'll have maybe hydrology and you'll have hydric soils a lot of times, but you may not have, there may be corn standing there. So you may have to look for some remnant or volunteer wetland vegetation, those obligate and fact wet species. So that guidance is something we really had to rely on, and I hadn't done that before. So it was very educational for me. And wetland boundaries were determined, of course, by visible changes in wetland vegetation communities, wetland and non-wet soils, topographic changes, and other visible distinctions between wetlands and uplands. And a hydrogeomorphic HGM approach was utilized for wetland classification. So this approach assesses the chemical, physical, and biological functions of a wetland based on its geomorphic setting, water source or supply, and hydrodynamics. Okay, so this was the result of our wetland delineation, and I do have a couple more poll questions. So question number 3 is just a quick, seeing if you're paying attention, what kind of wetlands is a rainwater basin wetland? All right, 76% of folks said playa wetlands, so good job. And then I have one more. Number 4 is, what's the primary agricultural commodity in the rainwater basin? All right, yep, corn. Almost 70% of folks said corn, and that is correct. And I know I'm keeping you in suspense on our wetland delineation results. But so like I said, utilizing all those resources, we identified 1.7 acres of agricultural wetlands. It was this area in blue, so right outside of the irrigation area. And so this in addition to being we did the desktop and then we did the on the ground, but then there was a bit of negotiation with the NRCS to get this number to where it is, because there's so much interpreting of historical imagery and looking at the wet and depressional signatures apparent within that imagery year to year. And so from there, you can identify what would be existing wetlands. And so, like I said, this is really interesting. You don't have the 3 coordinate indicators. So it's a new process, but essentially we're looking for areas that would be a wetland if, and without cultivated crops. Okay, so the kind of more regulatory stuff for permitting and consultation. Like I said, the NRCS, and like Will went through earlier, the NRCS really drove this process. We did use a nationwide permit 27 for the restoration activities, and there's some fine print at the bottom of that 27 that says, essentially, if the NRCS can give a 30-day notification prior to start of construction for this, if we don't hear back from the Corps or just in general. And we did try to go through the normal Corps process, but we really didn't get any activity on their end. So we ended up using that notification. We did do a Section 7 consultation initiated by NRCS with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So there are whooping cranes in the area. We ended up submitting a biological assessment, but then just ended up doing a just consultation, not likely to adversely affect letters, what we ended up with. Nebraska Game and Parks had a big role in this. Like I said, the wildlife management, North Lake Wildlife Management Area, North Lake Basin is adjacent to our site, and we create a contiguous wetland footprint with those folks. So they were important for that reason, but also because they're a state protected species in Nebraska and they have their own consultation process. So again, NRCS spearheaded that. We had Section 106, and then we also had NRCS cultural surveys conducted, and we didn't get any hits or objections from tribal nations, no concerns there. We did have a notice of intent for stormwater permitting that we had to submit 180 days prior to breaking ground. We had a stormwater protection plan and erosion and sediment controls in place. And then finally, at the local level, we did have to do a lot of meeting with the board, the Seward County board, and kind of explain what we're doing because it was very foreign to them. There were some processes like that thrown in, but ultimately we ended up getting a driveway permit because we did change the access to the site. So as far as process, it is a different process than the 404 wetland mitigation project development approach. So in obtaining approvals for this site, Westervelt worked with NRCS to develop mitigation banking instrument templates. We actually helped develop the templates because there were no templates. There hadn't been a standardized approach and kind of process developed for an NRCS agricultural mitigation bank in Nebraska. So Rich Nelson worked diligently with our team to develop those, and it was quite a process. We learned a ton. It was really wonderful working with NRCS through this. And we largely modeled this after the core compensatory mitigation documents as defined, the 12 different steps defined in the 2008 mitigation rule, and this includes prospectus recommending site planning and implementation approaches, a banking instrument, a short-term management plan that defines success and monitoring and management standards, and ultimately the credit release schedule for this site, a long-term maintenance and management plan defining long-term steward and management activities and funding, a perpetual conservation easement protecting the site from development in perpetuity, and naming NRCS as the long-term site steward. Other elements that we tried to kind of account for and plan for, and we worked with both Westervelt and NRCS's legal team to develop easement language. And this varies from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer compensatory mitigation bank easement because the NRCS does allow farming activities in the adjacent uplands protected by the easement, and allows for grazing of livestock and haying of reed canary grass and cattail in wetlands if necessary, if the populations get out of control. and which you can definitely plan for grazing in your 404 compensatory mitigation management activities too. But really, it's the haying and farming activities that are unique. And so we have a robust noxious species management plan, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, but we don't anticipate needing to hay. So we don't plan to do that. So the restoration activities, let's see, I have one more question. Question number 5, and I already misplaced it, so I'll wait until Brenna gets it up there. Oh yeah, okay, in which migratory flyway is the Rainwater Basin located? So just another kind of see if you're paying attention type question. All right, yep, 65% said the Central Flyway, and that is correct. So thank you. That is important because we do really care about our wildlife stakeholders, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the North Utica Agricultural Mitigation Bank comprises 40 acres of restored shallow playa rainwater basin wetlands. Like I said, it's contiguous to another wetland restoration project. So we had an analog, we had a really good reference site when designing our site. And so this ends up with our 40 acres of wetlands and what the North Lake Basin Wildlife Management Area hosts. It's about 200 acres of restored historic wetlands within that historic playa wetlands. So site construction included excavating 14 to 18 inches of soil within the B horizon, and we were careful not to penetrate or cut into the clay lens, since this is a precipitation driven system, and that clay layer is instrumental in holding water within the wetland basin. And so we ended up excavating 80,000 cubic yards, 60,000 cubic yards of dirt, I think, and spoiling that, balancing that on site in the upland areas on the western portion of the property. And per the Natural Resource Districts and NRCS's request, we did build in a buffer between the uplands and the recreated wetland cells, because it's a high wind erosion area, and this does help with sedimentation and protection of those newly restored wetlands. So we did work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to create more topographic diversity across the site for the benefit of birds. And Westervelt worked with NRCS and other stakeholders to identify and drill seed a native seed mix throughout the entire site. We included pollinator seed in the upland areas and the prairie strips as well. Okay, so for interim maintenance, and I'll kind of speed up a little bit because I know we want to wrap up in a few minutes, but historically the growth and succession of wetland plant communities in this area were kept in check by herds of grazing bison, elk, and pronghorn periodic fires. We obviously don't have that on the landscape anymore. So for our interim maintenance and monitoring activities, those are well defined. We do need to monitor annually and submit a report. In addition to fully funding our endowment, our long-term maintenance and management fund, and placing the conservation easement. These are necessary steps to get our credit releases. But maintenance activities comprise noxious weed management, grazing upon site stabilization potentially, and just making sure, some adaptive management approaches. Like right here, we had to reseed an area. We put out some mulch, hoping that an area that kind of got washed out with a big rain event will come back pretty quickly. And so grazing cattle, it may be a really important tool because it really emulates the effects of bison and other wild ungulates, and it helps to keep wetland vegetation in the early successional state that provided suitable migration habitat for waterfowl, shorebirds, and other wetland dependent birds. From a site stewardship long-term maintenance approach, the site has a long-term site protection instrument, like I mentioned earlier, and NRCS is the long-term site steward The endowment is with the National Fish and Wildlife Federation. And all this means that the site is protected by a conservation easement in perpetuity and managed in perpetuity with management funds set aside specifically allocated to the property's long-term viability and sustainability. And when we determine that funding, we use an endowment calculator, and it really details the increments, like the time and the amount of management activities. And so that can be like replacing a fence every 20 years, burning, grazing, other noxious species management that's required for this site to succeed. And so we do take that into consideration and work with National Fish and Wildlife Federation on that. So the last slide is benefits. You know, we feel good about all of our projects, but this project is really cool because it adds to an existing restored wetland footprint with a lot of benefits to the surrounding community and wildlife, particularly migratory birds. These sites kind of exist as a natural island in a sea of agriculture. So there's a lot of wildlife and water quality benefits. Northbound birds in the Central Flyway do need energy in the form of fat reserves to help complete their migration and to survive and reproduce on their breeding grounds. So, you know, the Rainwater Basin provides for calories, and the Rainwater Basin cornfields actually provide for a lot of calories, but waterfowl need nutrients provided by wetland plants as well. They need relatively secluded wetlands where they can roost without excessive disturbances, and shorebirds and other migratory birds the region rely on invertebrates found in healthy wetlands as well. And so we all know wetlands contribute to better water quality. This is particularly true at this site, which provides filtration for agricultural runoff, and flood benefits, flood amelioration with these wetland cells. So we know this to be of particular importance in the face of climate change. And really the putting native plants on the landscape feeds into the other items I discussed in terms of benefits, but the site also has aesthetic benefits to the landscape and community. It's not a cornfield, and although that does have a lot of value in our society, and we need that, this provides some diverse habitat on the landscape. And with that, we will take questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tyler and Will. That was really, really interesting, and we definitely have some questions. So let's see, we'll start with Mr. Royal Gardner. He was a presenter not too long ago, so thanks for the question, Royal. Are the mitigation banking documents available on Ribbits? It's a good question.
That is a good question. No, NRCS does not have their mitigation program in Ribbits. So, and that'd be something that would be great if it could evolve that way, just have access to that. But it's really handled kind of bank by bank. There's no ledgers available on Ribbits or anything.
Great. And to you guys in the audience, please remember to put your questions in the Q&A. I just noticed one in chat. It's just so I can get through them quicker. So we have an anonymous attendee who asked, was it deliberate choice to identify and delineate these wetlands using core procedures rather than NRCS procedures? Did the NRCS recommend that?
The NRCS kind of recommended all of them. So we did, yeah, I guess I should have included that as well, but it was NRCS's guidance to use Chapter 5 of that regional supplement and then the Regal letter. And so, yeah, we kind of threw a lot of different methods at this approach. That's a great question.
Yeah, and I have a couple of similar questions from Shane Slate and Britton Fedding, kind of alluding to the same thing with the regulatory guidance letter requested by the core district. It just seemed like the RGLs that had been rescinded, so it seemed odd that they'd be utilizing that over the regional supplement guidance.
It is an older document that's actually no longer viable if you look at the date range on it, but that was it wasn't a core request, it was an NRCS guide. It was NRCS guidance.
Yeah, and then Brenton kind of going into, similar questions, since this was through an NRCS program, their definition of normal circumstances maybe should have been used. More of a comment, I guess. And then Britton asked, this is another good question, did NRCS allow for haying on the restored upland through a compatible use agreement?
It's actually included in the easement. So all that language is codified or formalized in the conservation easement, and that really drives that long-term management agreement with NRCS.
Okay. And then Diane Hall, thanks for the question. Were the wetland soils tested for pesticides and metals prior to restoration? That's a really good question.
Yes, we did do some soil testing, and we didn't have any real concerns, especially since we removed all that soil within the wetlands and spoiled it in the uplands. We were removing a lot of those issues from those wetland cells.
Was there any topsoil left? Sorry, this is just a question that popped in my brain.
No, and actually, so it's interesting because I have not restored in that manner. When typically we salvage and replace the topsoil, but we followed what the Rainwater Basin joint venture does, as well as like Ted LaGrange's group and Rich Nelson's efforts at NRCS and Nebraska Game and Parks, and they removed that that layer, and then they just make sure that it's still within the bee horizon and you're not penetrating that clay lens. So it's a different approach than we historically have used. So that's a great question.
So Diane Hall had another question. Did you transfer soils from unimpacted playas in order to inoculate the new wetland with resident macro invertebrates that exist in resting phases in the dry soils and may not be able to colonize a new wetland?
No, we did not, but we do hope that we'll get some recruitment from that adjacent wetland. It's right directly adjacent, and it's been established for a long time. So we hope and plan to see a recruitment of a lot of, herbaceous as well as invertebrate species. We just hope that everything kind of moves on over.
I'm sure that's a part of one of your like performance standards.
Yeah, we have some pretty robust performance monitoring standards.
Okay. Well, great segue. What performance standards do you have for these types of mitigation projects? Asks Nathan Ronalden. I don't know how I didn't pronounce that right, I'm certain, but
yeah,
what are the standards?
Yeah, so annually we go out within the growing season, and actually it's an end of growing season assessment of the site, and that comprises looking at soils, looking at hydrology. We also have hydrologic monitoring infrastructure out there. So not piezometers, because that would be more groundwater, but we did have monitoring equipment out there. And also there's wildlife and vertebrate considerations and that data collection. So yeah, we do that at the end of the growing season. And we also visit, really, it seems like monthly, since we're in this interim maintenance and management period, just to make sure it's looking good. We regularly, routinely connect to the North Lake Basin manager. He sends us pictures and kind of gives us a heads up on what's going on out there, because it's about 6.5 hours from Golden, Colorado, where we sit.
Okay. Shoot, I had a question in my head after you said that, and then I lost it because I started reading another one. We'll move on. I've seen a USDA debt to nature wetlands easement when I performed a title search on an ag land before. Have you heard of it before? Is this a similar program? That's Nathan Renaudin. I don't know if that's
no. Nathan, I am writing that down. I'm going to learn about it. I'm not familiar with that. Thank you for that.
Let's see. And then we did have a question. Tyler, would you mind explaining what RIBITS is for Nancy Makofka?
Yes, I'm going to butcher the acronym. It's the Regulatory in lieu fee banking tracking system, something to that effect.
That's pretty good.
I got that wrong, but it is largely capturing what it is. It is a database where you can log on, and there's actually mitigation banking and water quality, mitigation, compensatory mitigation and water quality trading information on there. It's the Corps' central database for mitigation, banking, and in lieu fee sites. So you can look at district by district what mitigation sites have been established, and whether, it depends on the district, whether they keep this amount of detail up to date, but pending, active, withdrawn, terminated banks and in lieu fee programs. And so it's a really great resource to look at what's out there, what credits are available, because there's a ledger contact information, as well as there's a cyber repository, which each district may or may not require that the bank sponsor keep up to date, but you can pull some really cool documents from those as well. And you can spend hours on there. The water quality trading portion of it is state by state. So, and speaking to Valerie Lane, who kind of maintains this, this database, states can pay into it. And so I think that's where you would see, you know, to be included. So Virginia has a really robust water quality trading program. You can go on there and see what they have. You can toggle between those two programs when you go and look at the top left-hand corner of that website. But essentially, you know, going back to the very initial question about NRCS being on rivets, NRCS would need to set up an agreement for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to host their program, and they have not yet.
Yeah, Nancy, if you just Google rivets, I mean, like the frog rivets, it'll take you to it and you can play around in it. It's really a useful tool. Two more questions, you guys. Gordon Shaw asks, when would someone need to purchase credits from an agricultural mitigation bank? Is it needed when additional farmland is being considered for a wetland area?
You can take this one.
Yeah, so I think there's really kind of there's effectively two times when you would need it. So I kind of mentioned like the proactive and reactive time. On the proactive side of things, let's say that you purchased, you know, a 640, which is a pretty standard, you know, farm purchase. And, you know, near your center pivot on one of your 40s, there might be a pretty large wetland. And maybe that wetland is just, you know, crop rot. There's nothing really good happening there. It might be an operational nightmare when it comes to like harvesting and everything like that. So someone may opt to want to fill that wetland in to streamline their operations. They have a couple options really, right? They could either mitigate on their own land and have to basically establish a wetland on their own land, and then the NRCS will come out and kind of check on the performance of their wetland. Or they could come to the mitigation bank, and the mitigation bank is pretty great because ultimately they would cut us a check and we would release to them however many credits they were impacting. And like I was saying, it's in Nebraska right now, it's basically a 1-to-1, assuming that you're in the same type of wetland, which is all they're really letting people mitigate for. They're not letting people go out of kind. So that purchase would just take place, and then ultimately, just similar to a 404 bank, the liability for that mitigation then goes to the bank, and the producer's free to go ahead and fill their field, streamline their operations. The second, you know, option would be someone just preemptively did that. They basically went in and filled the thing, and then the NRCS caught on. So the NRCS now starts withholding their subsidies. And if they want to get their subsidies released, they have to mitigate. So they can either they still have those options, right? They can establish their own mitigation on land that they own, or they can come to the bank and mitigate through that process. And it's very quick, and you know, they would have their subsidies released almost immediately.
How many banks for agriculture are there? Do you guys know?
Nationwide?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah, we don't know. And
what about in your region?
Yeah, there's one other being developed in Nebraska currently, by Magnolia. They're great folks, and that's being established on the eastern side of the state for a totally different wetland type. And the NRCS is really great about not funding competing banks. I mean, that's not in their best interest, right, to put their funding into competing bank projects. But like in Iowa, it's a really robust program. There's probably 20 banks. So it just depends on where you are. NRCS, like I said, we worked with them to develop all the documents and kind of the process. So they're at a different place than Iowa is. And it's yet to be seen, you know, if this is a successful program in the state, quite frankly.
Okay. Well, I know we're at the end of the hour. There's a couple more questions. If folks don't mind, we'll hang on and have you answer them just so that we can, if that's okay with people. Christy Mower did say, gotta sign off, but great job, WES team. I don't know if she knows you guys, but that's really nice.
We love her. We love her.
Okay, so Pete Johnson asks, are the restored wetlands herbaceous only or forested as well? That's a good question.
These are herbaceous, and so it's really it's a very interesting management regime to kind of keep these wetlands in that herbaceous state and deal with encroachment of eastern red cedar is a big one out there, and kind of keep it in the PEM or pedestrian emergent type system. And historically, that's what playa wetlands were, and they were kept in check by fire and grazing of native wildlife.
Okay. And last question from Pete Johnson. What does an ag wetland mitigation bank credit sell for?
We're trying to figure that out too, but I think we and our competitors, well, they're not our competitors, but the other folks developing a site in the state are within, the $20,000 to $30,000 range. And so what goes into that is land purchase. These agricultural acres are worth 10 grand an acre. I mean, they're very expensive. And then you put in a long-term management and maintenance fund to protect and manage the site, and a conservation easement to protect and manage the site in perpetuity. Then you have 3 years of monitoring, and you have everything else that goes into it. And so it typically washes out at about 20 to 30 an acre in Nebraska. Now in Iowa, a lot of these folks are ag tilers that are, wrapping their program into their existing operations. And I think they're able to execute the program for less. But it kind of remains to be seen, really, because it's new, and we're just really getting in touch with people who need it.
Okay. Well, that was all of our attendees' questions. I had one last one that you may or may not be able to answer, but down here in Louisiana, we have Cajun Prairie. I'm sure you know, Tyler, about that. And I've been learning a lot about how we've lost a lot of our natural Cajun prairie. And I wonder if the NRCS has ever had any intentions of doing a program similar to this one, but for other habitat types that are either completely disappeared or disappearing. Do you guys know?
I don't know. I imagine Daniel Bollock's on here, and he's kind of one of the Cajun Prairie experts with Delta Land Services, or Billy Delaney. So they might know, because they've got a great relationship with the folks that do that restoration. But
Okay.
so they may be able to jump in on the chat. But we don't know what's going on in Louisiana, because it's outside of our regional reach.
Of course.
But Louisiana has not been identified, as far as I know, as a priority state for this program. And usually every year the NRCS has released this grant funding, they identify priority states. And so typically the funding goes to one of those. And I'm not sure I've seen that Louisiana is listed. I could totally be wrong, but there are definitely more people with more expertise on this call, I'm sure.
Okay. Well, fair enough. Thank you guys so much. This was such a good conversation. We really appreciate your time. And grateful to have you both, Will and Tyler. So thanks.
Thanks, Amber. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, no
This was fun.
problem. So
Reach
thanks.
out. Yeah,
Yeah.
reach out if you have any questions.
Absolutely. We are so proud to recognize our SWS webinar series sponsors for 2023. That's BioApp, Cattails Environmental, Davy Mitigation, and Ducks Unlimited. You can find their information at the websites listed above. Please visit, like, and follow our SWS webinar sponsors. Our next Spanish language webinar will be June 22nd, and on July 20th, we'll have our next English webinar on a broad scale 2,500 acre wetland habitat restoration project in South Florida. That sounds really good. We'll be taking, of course, the month of June off for English webinars, since the SWS annual meeting will be taking place June 27th through 30th. So don't forget to register if you haven't already. Check out our website and social media channels to learn more and register for upcoming events. And don't forget to complete the survey that will be sent to you after this webinar in order for you to receive a certificate of participation and provide feedback on these webinar series. We really appreciate that feedback, and we feel like it contributes to just how great it is and how great our speakers are. So we appreciate you doing that. Thanks again to Tyler and Will, to our audience, for participating today. Have a wonderful day, you guys. Be safe, be well, all the things. Bye. Bye, Will. Bye, Tyler.